Get off the floor. You're humiliating my family." Evelyn froze, breath caught mid-laugh, palms pressed to the thick Persian rug. On her back, little Jonathan Beaumont clung like a cowboy on a gentle mare, his small hands fisted in the fabric of her blouse, a paper sheriff's badge crooked on his pajama shirt. The afternoon light poured through the high windows of the Beaumont estate, warm and honey gold, turning dust motes into slow drifting sparks. Somewhere deeper in the house, a grandfather clock ticked with patient disapproval. Richard Beaumont stood in the doorway in a charcoal suit, jaw-tight tie still perfectly aligned, as if grief itself hadn't dared touch it. His voice, low and clipped, filled the room. "Off. Now." Evelyn eased Jonathan down carefully. The boy slid to the rug, breathless and pink-cheeked, the first color he'd shown in weeks. He reached for the toy hat he'd dropped, the felt brim crushed underfoot during their game. Evelyn straightened, smoothing her skirt, keeping her hands open and visible like that might make her intentions easier to read. "He asked me to play sir," she said, soft, steady. "Just 5 minutes." "My son is not a spectacle," Richard answered. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The hard shine in his eyes did the work for him. "I hired you to keep this house in order, not—" He gestured at the scene hat crayons, a paper horse folded from yesterday's mail. "This." Jonathan edged behind Evelyn's leg, the way children hide when they want to be seen only by the person they trust. His fingers found the hem of her blouse and pinched. Evelyn took a breath that tasted of lemon polish and old velvet. "With respect, Mr. Beaumont." He laughed. He hasn't laughed in a long time. Richard's gaze flicked to his son, quick, unwilling, and back. "That is not your concern." "He hasn't been sleeping either," Evelyn said, the words escaping before she could stop them. "The nightmares." "That will be handled," he snapped. But the last word thinned as if he'd run out of breath before the sentence was done. He crouched to Jonathan's level, smoothing the boy's hair with a practiced motion that looked like memory more than instinct. "Come here, John." Jonathan didn't move. He looked up at Evelyn instead. It was small, just the turn of a face, but it was also everything. "Come," Richard repeated. He didn't tug. He waited. After a beat, Jonathan stepped out, the paper badge hanging lopsided over his heart. As Richard lifted him, the boy's smile slipped, as if someone had pinched out a flame. He folded into his father's arms, but didn't cling. Evelyn lowered her eyes. "I would never put him at risk," she said. I'm trying to help." Richard's reply was quiet, almost civil. "Help is not crossing lines. We have lines in this house, Ms. Carter." The grandfather clock ticked between them once, twice, like a referee refusing to intervene. Richard turned the boy on his hip, the hat still stranded on the rug. He paused only long enough to look back at the scattered page of stick figure drawings, 3 hands joined under a sun, a 4th small one hovering above like a star. His mouth flattened. Then he carried his son down the hall, footsteps growing softer, softer, gone. When the room was empty, the stillness snapped back around Evelyn like a cold sheet. The paper horse lay under the coffee table, one folded ear bent. She bent with it, collecting crayons, stacking picture books, smoothing the rug where her knees had pressed a faint pattern into the nap. She found the felt hat last, and dusted it with her palm as if care could erase the moment that had just happened. In the kitchen, the evening air hummed with the soft, harmless sounds of a big house pretending to be normal. The fridge motor's low drone, the whisper of vents. She poured water into the kettle. Not for tea, she wouldn't touch the good leaves this late, but just to hold the heat. The brass handle warmed her palms. She let it. The night deepened. In the corridor, the lights dimmed to their after-hours glow, and the portraits along the wall slipped from faces into shapes. Evelyn climbed the back stairs, past the quiet of rooms that were too large for one family's sorrow. At Jonathan's door, she paused. From inside, nothing. No whimpers, no feet pattering to the floor. Maybe tonight would be better. She set the hat on his pillow anyway, right where a dreaming boy might find it. Then she turned off the lamp, and the room returned to the silver hush of moonlight. Downstairs again, she took a seat at the edge of the breakfast nook where the morning sun usually spills in. The marble tabletop kept its cool even in summer. She pressed her fingertips there to keep from shaking. She had learned long ago that losing your balance doesn't start with a fall. It starts with a voice telling you you're not allowed to stand. In the glass, she caught her reflection, tired eyes, careful shoulders, the posture of someone who makes herself smaller to fit the space she has been given. She exhaled. Lines, she murmured to the empty room, testing the word like it might bruise her tongue. The kettle clicked off. Far down the hall, a door opened and closed, a soft, tired sound. Richard heading to his study, or passing the kitchen to make the espresso he never drank. She didn't turn to look. She didn't want to be a shadow that startled him. She didn't want to be an argument waiting in a doorway. Instead, she reached into her pocket and touched the folded scrap of paper she kept there. Naomi's name was inked at the top in a child's hand, the letters uneven and brave. Not tonight, she told herself. Not yet. Upstairs, the house settled, a creak, a sigh, like a body finding a position it could stand for a few hours. Evelyn rose, rinsed the empty mug, and stacked it gentle as a prayer. She turned off the light and stood for a beat in the doorway, letting the darkness shape itself around what had been said and what hadn't. By morning, the Beaumont estate would look immaculate again, fresh flowers in the foyer, the linen crisp, the surfaces shining. But beneath the gleam, something raw would keep breathing. A boy who needed someone to stay, a father learning how to, a woman deciding where to stand, when the lines others drew didn't fit the shape of love. And that was where the real story began, when the day broke over a house too quiet for its size, and the first footsteps in the hall decided who this home would be for. The next morning, the Beaumont estate looked exactly as it always had, immaculate, polished, as if grief had no permission to leave fingerprints on its surfaces. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, gilding the marble floors, the crystal vases, the gilded frames of ancestors who stared down with frozen, superior calm. But for all the shine, the house felt hollow, like a stage set left behind after the actors had gone home. Evelyn Carter carried a tray of breakfast toward the kitchen. She kept her movements quiet, almost invisible, because invisibility had always been the safest way to survive in this house. Behind her, the hush was so complete, she could hear the faint ticking of the old clock in the foyer. It was the sound of a house waiting for something that never came. At the top of the stairs, young Jonathan's door creaked open. The boy emerged slowly, clutching the paper sheriff's badge Evelyn had placed on his pillow the night before. His steps were careful, like a child who knows. Laughter can sometimes summon silence too quickly. He padded into the kitchen where Evelyn was setting plates down. "Morning, Sheriff," she said softly, giving him a small smile. He didn't answer. His eyes, shadowed with a weariness too heavy for 6 years old, darted toward the study door at the far end of the hall. That's where his father spent most mornings, behind a wall of conference calls and unread messages. Jonathan slid into a chair at the breakfast table. He pushed his food around the plate but didn't take a bite. Evelyn sat across from him, resisting the instinct to reach out to tuck a curl of his hair behind his ear. She had already been told once she had crossed lines. Still, when the boy's lip trembled, she whispered, "It's all right to miss her, you know." Jonathan's gaze dropped. I don't remember her voice anymore, he murmured. His small fingers pressed against the badge, flattening the wrinkled paper. Evelyn's chest tightened, but before she could answer, a voice cut across the room. Jonathan! Eat! Richard Beaumont stood in the doorway. His suit was already immaculate, his tie a shade of blue that matched the steel in his eyes. He looked at the untouched eggs, the bent paper badge, the way his son leaned toward the woman across from him, and his jaw set tighter. I'm not hungry, Jonathan whispered. Richard's silence was heavy, the kind that spoke louder than reprimands. He turned his attention to Evelyn, and though he said nothing, the message was clear: stay in your place. She lowered her eyes, gathering the plates with steady hands. But as she moved past him, she felt the weight of his gaze on her back, sharp, judging, conflicted. Later that day, while Evelyn folded linens in the laundry room, she heard voices echo from the front hall. They weren't Richard's. These were higher, sharper, laced with practiced elegance. She peeked out and saw a woman sweeping in coat draped over her shoulders, like a mantle heels striking the floor with the precision of a judge's gavel. Claudia Hale, Rebecca Beaumont's younger sister. Where is my nephew? Claudia's voice filled the foyer, smooth but edged. Her eyes caught Evelyn's presence, narrowed, and then dismissed her in an instant, as though she were just another piece of furniture polished to reflect the wealth of the house. Upstairs, Richard answered curtly. Claudia's gaze flicked back toward Evelyn. And who is she to hover so near him? I do hope you're not confusing a servant with family. The words cut, not for their sharpness, but for the ease with which they were spoken. Evelyn kept her head bowed, folding her hands before her apron. Jonathan, peering from the landing, shuffled closer to her side, his little hand curling around hers. That was when Evelyn understood. Whatever lines Richard insisted on, whatever silence Claudia demanded, Jonathan had already chosen. He had chosen trust. He had chosen her. And though the household gleamed with wealth and order beneath it, ran a current of quiet battles, the father hiding behind grief and pride, the aunt tightening her grip on legacy and appearances, and the boy caught between them, leaning toward the one person the world still saw as disposable. Evelyn knew this balance couldn't hold forever. Something would have to give. And when it did, every line drawn in this house would be tested. The storm began quietly, as storms often do, whispers before thunder. It started with small interruptions. Evelyn reading Jonathan a story in the garden, only to hear the study window slide open and Richard's voice cut across the air. That's enough. He has schoolwork. Or Claudia arriving unannounced, bringing Jonathan toys wrapped in paper far too fine for play, then arching a brow when the boy abandoned them to chase butterflies with Evelyn instead. Curious, Claudia murmured one afternoon, her heels clicking against the marble as she trailed behind Richard. He seems to prefer the maid's company over his own family. The word maid carried no venom in its letters, yet it landed like a slap. Evelyn bit her tongue. Jonathan tightened his grip on her hand. Richard said nothing, though the flicker of his eyes, cold, quick, told her he'd heard it too. In the evenings the house was quieter, but not calmer. Jonathan's nightmares returned with force. He thrashed against sheets damp with sweat, calling for a mother who would never come. Evelyn rushed to him, her voice weaving lullabies into the dark, until his small body loosened and sleep reclaimed him. Sometimes when she looked up, Richard stood frozen in the doorway, fists clenched at his sides, torn between stepping closer and retreating. More often he chose retreat. Claudia, however, pressed forward. She cornered Evelyn in the hallway one morning, her perfume sharp as cut roses. "You may think you're helping," she whispered, voice sweet enough to sting, "but you're building dependence. Children cling to whatever is near, and when you're gone, and you will be, he'll crumble." Evelyn met her gaze, calm but steady. then perhaps the answer is not to leave. Claudia's smile faltered, then sharpened. Careful. You may forget your place. But Evelyn hadn't forgotten. She had scrubbed these floors, polished these windows, stitched buttons back onto shirts she couldn't afford to buy. She knew her place better than anyone. Yet Jonathan's laughter when she spun him around the yard, his whispered thank you after nightmares, those moments carved out a new space one Claudia couldn't erase with words. Still, pressure mounted. Reporters began to appear at the gates, snapping photos whenever Evelyn stepped outside. Headlines speculated widower distracted child left in hands of stranger. Rumors spread faster than she could silence them. Even the staff began to whisper when they thought she wasn't listening. Through it all, Evelyn stayed measured. She folded towels with care, prepared meals with quiet precision, and answered Jonathan's endless questions with the patience of someone who knew that children remember how you make them feel, not the titles you carry. But the attacks didn't stop. Richard grew sharper in his words, Claudia bolder in her accusations. Every kindness Evelyn offered seemed to twist into evidence against her. And yet each time Jonathan slipped his hand into hers, each time he whispered, "Don't go." Evelyn found herself rooted deeper. Calm, unshaken, she would not raise her voice. She would not lash back. Her strength was quieter than theirs, but not weaker. Because she knew something they did not. Storms do not break houses by shouting at their walls. They break them by finding the cracks no one bothered to mend. And in the Beaumont estate, those cracks were widening by the day. That night, the house was so still it felt almost abandoned. The chandeliers had been dimmed, the staff dismissed, and only the echo of Jonathan's breathing upstairs broke the silence. Evelyn sat alone at the kitchen table, the faint glow of a single lamp spilling across the marble surface. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled a folded sheet of paper from her apron pocket, a paper worn soft at the creases, ink smudged from years of being touched but never shared. She began to write. "Mr. Beaumont, you don't know me beyond the chores I do, but I know something of grief. I once held my daughter Naomi as her breath faded from her body. I worked 3 jobs to keep her alive as long as I could. She was 7 when she slipped away. Since then, I have carried both the ache and the gift of remembering what love sounds like when it's gone. Your son is drowning in silence, sir, but silence will not heal him. Connection will. If you cannot yet give that to him, let me at least help until you can." She set the pen down her chest tight and placed the letter where she knew Richard would find it, beside the espresso machine he used every morning. She didn't sign it as a maid nor as a nanny, but simply Evelyn Carter. The next morning, Richard lingered longer than usual in the kitchen. He picked up the letter, eyes scanning line after line, and for the first time in weeks, he didn't immediately retreat into the study. He slipped the folded page into his pocket and said nothing. But his silence felt different, not empty, but heavy with thought. That evening, Evelyn passed the study on her way to collect laundry. The door was ajar. Through the gap, she saw a sight that stopped her cold. Richard awkwardly perched on a tiny chair, knees bent high, while Jonathan sat cross-legged on the rug with a picture book. The boy's small voice carried as he pointed to illustrations, and Richard's stone-faced Richard was listening. Not correcting, not rushing, not checking his phone, just listening. Evelyn turned away before they noticed her, but a flicker of hope lit quietly in her chest. A few days later in the garden, Jonathan darted too close to the koi pond, his foot slipping on moss. Evelyn sprinted across the yard, catching him by the waist just before he toppled in. Her knees hit the ground, mud streaking her skirt, her heart pounding as Jonathan clung to her. Richard burst out the sliding door moments later. "What happened?" His voice was sharp with panic. Jonathan looked up, still breathless. Miss Evelyn saved me, Daddy. I almost fell, but she caught me. Richard's eyes met Evelyn's across the boy's head. For the first time, guilt, not pride, darkened his expression. That night he found her in the laundry room. His voice was lower, softer than it had ever been. I read your letter, he said. And I've been a fool. You didn't just save him today. You've been saving him all along. Evelyn didn't answer immediately. She folded a towel, placed it neatly on the stack, and then met his eyes. I didn't do it for gratitude, Mr. Beaumont. I did it because he needs someone to stay. Someone he can count on. Richard cleared his throat, looking away. You shouldn't be scrubbing floors. Not anymore. You're not the maid. You're Jonathan's nanny, effective immediately. Evelyn blinked, unsure she had heard right. His tone held no grandeur, no flourish, just a quiet certainty. And in that certainty, a line had shifted. The peace didn't last. Just as spring light softened the gardens of the Beaumont estate, a sharper wind began to stir. Claudia Hale returned this time not with passing remarks, but with papers, lawyers, and cameras. She swept into the foyer one Saturday morning, her heels striking the marble like gunfire. Jonathan froze halfway down the staircase, clutching his toy sheriff's badge, while Evelyn stood rooted by the doorway. You think you can replace my sister? Claudia's voice carried smooth, yet cutting. She thrust a folder toward Richard. The petition has been filed. I'm seeking guardianship. Maxwell belongs with blood, not with strangers who insert themselves where they don't belong. Richard's jaw tightened, his hand closing around the folder without opening it. Leave, Claudia. You're upsetting my son. But it was already too late. Jonathan's small shoulders hunched, his eyes darting between the adults. His voice cracked. Daddy, are they taking me away? Evelyn knelt immediately, gathering him close, whispering, No one is taking you anywhere, sweetheart. Yet her words trembled with the weight of what might come. Within a week, the estate gates were besieged by reporters. Headlines screamed, Widower, distracted child, raised by housemaid. Paparazzi snapped Evelyn's photograph as though she were a figure of scandal, not sacrifice. Claudia fed the storm, granting interviews, claiming Evelyn was manipulating grief for her own gain. The battle reached its peak in the courtroom. The chamber was hushed, the judge presiding with an unreadable gaze. Claudia sat immaculate in black, a framed portrait of her late sister, propped dramatically at her table. Evelyn sat behind Richard, palms pressed tight together, heart pounding, as though it might leap from her chest. The questioning was ruthless. Claudia's attorney pressed Evelyn on every detail of her past, Naomi's death, her debts, her lack of formal training. Wouldn't you say, the lawyer sneered, that you are projecting your loss onto this child, that you are confusing your role? Evelyn's throat burned, but her voice stayed steady. No. I am not replacing his mother. I am making sure he still has someone who sees him. That is not confusion. That is care. The lawyer smirked. And yet you cook for him. You comfort him in the night. You even call yourself his nanny now. Isn't it true, Miss Carter, that you've stepped into the role of his mother? Before Evelyn could answer, Richard's voice cut like steel across the room. She stepped into the role because I asked her to. Because my son needed her. Don't twist devotion into theft. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Claudia's face tightened, her grip white-knuckled on the photo of her sister. But the decisive moment came when the judge, after hours of testimony, turned to Jonathan. Young man, she said gently, would you like to speak? The room stilled. Jonathan slid from his chair, clutching his sheriff's hat in both hands. His small voice wavered at first, then grew clear. I want to stay with Daddy and with Miss Evelyn. She saved me when I almost fell in the pond. She makes spaghetti on Tuesdays because Mommy used to. She reads to me when I'm scared. She makes me feel safe. Please don't take me away." The silence that followed was heavier than any gavel. Even the reporters in the gallery stopped scribbling, their pens hovering mid-air. Evelyn's eyes blurred with tears. Richard reached for his son, pride and relief breaking across his usually guarded face. Claudia tried to speak, but her words fell flat against the quiet truth of a child's plea. When the judge finally delivered her ruling, her voice was calm but resolute. "The petition for guardianship is denied. Maxwell Beaumont remains with his father." Claudia surged to her feet, fury flashing, but the gavel struck once more. Order restored. Case closed. In that instant, the lopsided power of the Beaumont estate shifted. Not with wealth, not with threats, but with the undeniable voice of a child who chose love over appearances. The ride back to the estate was quiet, though it carried a different kind of weight than the ride to court. Jonathan leaned against Evelyn's side in the car, cowboy hat tipped low, clutching her hand even as his eyes drooped. When they pulled through the gates, the boy whispered, half asleep, "We won, Miss Evelyn. We really won." "Yes, sweetheart," she murmured, kissing his curls. "You're safe." Inside, the staff greeted them with cautious smiles, relief written plainly across faces that had grown tense during the weeks of trial. The grand foyer, once filled with reporters' shouts, and Claudia's accusations, now held only the echo of Jonathan's sudden laughter as he darted upstairs with his hat bouncing. For the first time in months, the house felt alive again. That evening, Evelyn found herself in the kitchen, apron dusted with flour, guiding Jonathan's small hands over a rolling pin. "Spaghetti Tuesdays," he declared proudly, sauce splattered across his cheek. "Every week, forever." Richard appeared in the doorway, tie-loosened sleeves rolled up. He watched for a moment before stepping in. "Need another pair of hands?" Jonathan beamed. "Yes, Daddy." "You can stir so." Richard stirred clumsily, while Evelyn guided Jonathan, and laughter bubbled through the room until the walls seemed to sigh with relief. Dinner that night wasn't spread across the long dining table as before. Instead, the three of them sat close, shoulder to shoulder, sauce smeared and content. When Jonathan finally nodded off, full and smiling, Richard lingered by his bedside. Evelyn stood in the doorway, arms folded gently. Richard's voice was low, almost reverent. "He looks like her when he sleeps." Evelyn stepped closer, setting a blanket over the boy. "And when he laughs, he looks like you." For a long moment, they stood together in the hush of Jonathan's room, the boys breathing steady, the storm behind them. Then Richard whispered, "Thank you for giving him back what I couldn't." Evelyn shook her head. "Thank him. He's the reason I stayed." In the weeks that followed, a new rhythm emerged. Richard joined them at breakfast instead of rushing to the office. Jonathan's nightmares lessened as Evelyn taught him small breathing exercises at bedtime. And though grief still hovered in corners of the house, the silence no longer crushed it, simply reminded. One morning, Richard called Evelyn into his study. On the desk lay a folder stamped with a simple logo, the New Dawn Foundation. Inside were mission statements, plans for outreach partnerships already in motion. "It's time," Richard said. "Not just for us, for families like ours, for children like Max, like Naomi." His voice faltered slightly, but steadied again. "This isn't charity, it's a promise. A second chance for others." Evelyn's breath caught. She traced the logo with her fingertips, then met his gaze. "You'd put my name on this." Not just your name, he replied. Your story. People need to hear it. And so a month later, the grand parlor of the Beaumont estate filled again, but this time not with reporters hungry for scandal, but with families, counselors, donors, and children who had known loss. Jonathan darted among them, introducing Evelyn with pride. This is Miss Evelyn. She makes the best spaghetti and she saves people. Richard took the podium, his voice steady. This foundation exists because one woman reminded us that grief doesn't end us, it connects us. Evelyn Carter gave my son laughter again. And now together we want to give that hope to others. Applause rose, not polished, but genuine. Evelyn's throat tightened. She stepped forward, her own words trembling, but true. I never thought my pain could mean anything to anyone else. But if telling my story helps even one child feel less alone, then Naomi's life and her loss still shines here with us. In the crowd, Jonathan clapped the loudest, his paper badge pinned proudly to his chest. That night, as the guests departed, and silence settled over the estate once more, Evelyn stood in the garden, staring at the pond where she had once caught Jonathan before he fell. Richard joined her hands in his pockets. This house feels different now, he said quietly. Because it's not just a house anymore, Evelyn replied. It's a home. And for the first time she believed it. Spring settled over the Beaumont estate with a gentleness no court could decree. The gardens, once stark and silent, bloomed again, lavender brushing the stone paths, where Jonathan now chased butterflies with his sheriff's badge pinned proudly to his shirt. The laughter that had once been rare now echoed daily, bouncing off the marble halls, like a melody that belonged there all along. One afternoon, Evelyn found a drawing tucked under her pillow. Jonathan's careful crayons had etched 3 stick figures beneath a yellow sun. Tall man in a suit, one woman with long hair, and a boy with a cowboy hat. Above them, floating high, was a small figure with wings. Beneath it, he had scrawled in uneven letters, "My family." Her eyes stung as she traced each line. Naomi, her. Naomi was part of his picture now, not as a shadow, but as light. Jonathan had given her daughter a place in his story, as if to tell her, doesn't vanish, it transforms. That evening, the 3 of them sat around the kitchen table, spaghetti steaming in bowls, tomato sauce smudging Jonathan's chin. Richard chuckled as Evelyn wiped the boy's mouth with a napkin. For a moment, the scene was so ordinary, it felt extraordinary. A billionaire father, his son, and the woman who had once been dismissed as just the help breaking bread, as though they had always been a family. Later, as the moon lifted silver over the pond, Evelyn stepped outside. The same pond where she had once caught Jonathan before the water claimed him shimmered under the night sky. Richard joined her, his hands in his pockets, his gaze softer than she had ever seen. "You've changed everything," he said simply. Evelyn shook her head. No. Jonathan did. He chose love even when the world told him to fear. They stood in silence, listening to the hum of night, the faint echo of a child's laughter drifting through the open windows. Evelyn tilted her face toward the sky, whispering to Naomi, "We're safe now." And for the first time, the words rang true, because the story was no longer about a maid or a tycoon or even the storm of a courtroom battle. It was about what remained after the dust settled, the quiet courage of staying, the healing found in laughter, and the truth that family is not bound by blood or titles, but by those who refuse to walk away. In the end, the Beaumont estate stood not as a monument to wealth, but as a symbol of second chances, of how grief can carve out emptiness, but love, steady, patient, unyielding, can fill it again. And in that truth lay the message Evelyn hoped the world would remember, that dignity, kindness, and the courage to love through loss are the real forms of wealth. Wealth no storm can erase. True strength is not measured by wealth or titles, but by the quiet courage to love, to stand firm against prejudice, and to choose compassion even when the world draws its lines against you. This story reminds us that family is built not only by blood, but by presence, dignity, and the willingness to stay when it's hardest. In life, storms may come, but as the saying goes, every cloud has a silver lining, and often that light is found in the people who refuse to give up on us. What did this story stir in you? Share your thoughts or a similar experience in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more stories that challenge, inspire, and heal. Wishing you peace, strength, and hope on your own journey forward.